So good morning everyone, special Mom Jessica. Our topic is relative clause constructions on lecture 23 to 24. As a continuation of Nicole's discussion, I will now present the next part of our topic report, which focuses on subject relative clauses and that relative clauses. So, relative clause gives extra information about a noun. So, a noun is a word that names a person, place, thing, or idea. So, it describes or identifies it more clearly. So, these clauses usually start with words like who, which, that, or whom. So, for example, in the sentence, the girl who sings beautifully won the contest. So the clause who sings beautifully gives more information about the girl. So without the relative clause, we just have the girl won the contest. But the clause adds important details. So in syntax, this is called modifying a noun phrase. So now let's move on to the subject relative clause. So these are relative clauses that describe the subject of the sentence. So the key thing to remember is that the relative pronoun such as who or that functions as the subject within that clause. So let's look at the example here. So we call the senators who met Fred. So here who met Fred is the relative clause and who is the subject of met. So if we remove the relative pronoun who and say we call the senators met Fred, it becomes grammatically incorrect. So that's why subject relative clauses always require a relative pronoun. So to become it cannot be left out. So, the structure of subject-relative clauses. In syntax diagrams, linguists describe a missing subject inside the relative clause. So, the missing element is called a gap. So, it represents where the noun would normally appear. So, the relative pronoun like who fills in for that missing noun and connects the clause back to the main noun it's modifying. So, for example, in who met Fred, the word who stands for the senators or kanang the real subject that's missing inside the clause. So, syntactically, who acts as a link between the main noun phrase and the verb met. So, this relationship allows the relative clause to attach to the noun or kanang senators. So here's another example of the from the lecture notes. So the sentence is, he made a statement which everyone thought was really interesting. So the relative clause here, which everyone thought was really interesting, so gives us more information about the noun statement. So inside that clause, which represents the missing subject of was interesting. So even though which appears at the start of the clause, it actually fills a subject position deep inside the sentence structure. So that's how subject relative clauses work syntactically. So there's always a gap that the relative pronoun connects to. Now that we understand subject relative clauses, so let's move on to another closely related type, the that relative clauses. So this one also modifies a noun, but it behaves slightly differently because of how the word that functions. So the word that is special in English because it can serve two different functions. First is it can be a complementizer, which means it connects a clause to a verb. So for example is Mary knows that John was elected. So in this sentence, that introduces a new clause but doesn't describe a noun. Second is that can act as a relative pronoun. So as in this is the book that we read. So in this case, it introduces a relative clause that describes the noun book. So depending on how it's used, that can either connect or connect ideas or describe nouns. So, features of relative clauses. When that is used as a relative pronoun, it can often replace who or which. So, for example, here is we can say the president abandoned the people that voted for him instead of who voted for him. So, another example is it is an argument that people think will never end. So this usage is very common in both formal and informal English. So the meaning is almost the same as who or which, but that is often used when we want the sentence to sound simpler and more direct. So even though that is flexible, it has some limitations. We cannot use that after preposition. So for example, the pencil with that he is writing is ungrammatical, di ba? So instead we must say the pencil with which he is writing. Also, that only appears in finite clauses. So meaning clauses that have a full verb form and tense. So we can say a pencil with that to write or kanang something similar. So these small details helps us see how syntax rules shape the way English sentences are formed. So to summarize everything, subject relative clauses describe the subject of the sentence and always include a relative pronoun like who or that. So these clauses contains what we call a gap, a missing subject that the relative pronoun fills. So meanwhile, that relative clauses use the word that as a connector or a relative pronoun. So it can often replace who or which, but it cannot be used after prepositions. Both of these types of clauses helps us make our sentences more descriptive and grammatically complete. So that's all, mom. Thank you.